Ich möchte jetzt unseren Autor von dem Opening Address einladen. Alan Kahan ist ein Professor für die britische Zivilisation an der Universität Versailles. Der hat das wunderbare Buch geschrieben, Freedom from Fear. Das Buch wurde genannt das beste Buch des Jahres von Financial Times und Foreign Affairs. Und wir würden sehr gerne hören, was du, Alan, denkst über Liberalismus, die Herausforderungen, aber was vielleicht die wichtigste Sache ist. Was tun? Dankeschön.
Dankeschön, Carolina. Thank you to the Centrum and to all those who've given me the honor of addressing this very distinguished audience and our very distinguished panelists. As you will gather, I will be speaking in English. My apologies, but my German really isn't very good. So when I was originally invited to speak, I was asked to speak about liberalism and populism. This became, as you will see in the program, freedom. But that's okay, because after all, liberalism means freedom. Indeed, as I tried to define it in the book, I spent a good decade or so trying to understand or trying to create a one-sentence definition of liberalism that would mean something to ordinary people and would not be meaningless for professionals. And what I came up with apologies to Montesquieu, is that liberalism is the search for a society in which no one need be afraid. No one means no one. Not the poor, not the rich, not the white, not the black, not the homosexual, not the heterosexual, not the immigrant, not the native-born. No one. Such a society, which of course has never actually existed, that is the utopian element in liberalism, such a society would be a liberal society, and such a society would be a free society. And it's the history of that movement, the history of that tradition that I chronicled in my short 500-page book, Freedom from Fear, an incomplete history of liberalism. Now, of course, liberalism did not at first devote itself to fighting against all of these fears. It began in the 16th, 17th century by being mostly concerned with religious persecution, with absolute despotism. In the 19th century, the main focus of liberal fears turned to revolution on the one hand, reaction on the other, the famous Scylla and Charybdis, I don't know how we quite pronounce that in German, that every liberal 19th century writer is always referring to, how we steer our bark to avoid these threats to freedom from both the right and the left. In the late 19th century, liberals became concerned with poverty as their main fear, no longer fearing the poor, but recognizing that poverty was a threat to the freedom of the poor. And then, in the 20th century, totalitarianism became the dominant fear that liberals fought. All of these fears created diverse historical kinds of liberalism. In the 17th and 18th century, what we can call proto-liberalism, because the word liberalism did not yet have a political content. In the 19th century, liberalism 1.0, with apologies to Microsoft. In the late 19th century, early 20th century, when poverty became the dominant fear, modern liberals who adopted the use of the state to fight poverty classical liberals who feared that using the state to fight poverty would result in a new kind of despotism and create new kinds of fears. And then in the 20th century, liberalism 3.0, from the Ordo liberals to the egalitarian liberals of John Rawls to libertarians and so on. And today, of course, we are confronted by a new fear that concentrates liberal minds: populism. Now, there is considerable debate about whether or not populism is democratic, but there is no debate about whether populism is liberal. It is not. One can be perhaps an illiberal Democrat. One cannot be a liberal populist. And for a very simple reason. Populists always want to make someone afraid. Sometimes it's black people, sometimes it's white people, always it's immigrants, but always populists want to make someone afraid, and therefore populists can never be, are never, liberals. And it is the rise of populism which is what has created the turbulence that our conference is forced to address today. How did we get here? Things looked so different in 1992. Clearly, things have gone wrong. And the first way to put them right is to try to figure out why they went wrong. And let me suggest they went wrong as a result of a long process, one that did not begin in 1992, although it accelerated thereafter, one that really began in the aftermath of the Second World War, when liberals began what I call the moral disarmament of liberalism. Let me give you an idea of what I mean. 2 days ago, in The Guardian, there appeared a column which I did not pay to have written for the sake of this audience, but which I would have paid if I could have, in which the columnist, who is a self-described liberal, a member of the editorial board of both The Guardian and The Observer, wrote the following. And she said, "Liberalism has much to offer, but there are risks in embracing it as an overarching political philosophy without a degree of humility about its shortcomings. Its hollow silence over how to navigate knotty ethical issues where society needs some kind of shared understanding. This queasiness about morality means liberals sometimes look the other way when others smuggle in controversial ethical assumptions under the guise of choice and autonomy." Now, I suggest to you that this would have been a completely nonsensical paragraph to have written around 1900 or 1850, when liberals were constantly addressing knotty ethical issues. But it made perfect sense that she felt this way in 2025 and referred to the fact that her education as a liberal simply did not prepare her to talk about questions like the sanctity of life or other ethical issues which we are constantly confronted with. Human nature abhors a moral vacuum. If liberals will not talk about moral issues, if liberals will not take ethical positions, populists will and have filled the void that we have left empty. This has been going on since the Second World War. In technical terms, this is the decline of liberal perfectionism. Liberals ceased talking about what a good human life might look like. They simply talked about one's ability to make a choice. Milton Friedman famously wrote a book, Freedom to Choose, without actually telling us what you ought to choose. You tell your average adolescent, you are free to make your own choices, and the adolescent is very happy. And then they ask you, so what choice should I make? Should I spend all my time living a very trivial life, watching video games? And Milton Friedman has nothing to say. I'm sure as an individual he did, but not in his book. And so the adolescent turns to someone who might actually give them some advice, some more useful advice. We have to respect that freedom to choose, of course, but we also have to have something to say about the choice. Liberal political theorists from John Rawls to Robert Nozick did their best to stop talking in moral terms or to limit those moral terms, that moral pillar of liberalism, to such an extent that it could support nothing. Now, this was made possible by the specific circumstances of our post-World War II world. For the first time in its history, liberalism had no enemies on the right in, say, 1960, in most of the Western world. All those right-wing enemies had joined liberalism in the fight against communism. Communism falls, and liberalism is once again engaged in its traditional two-front war against Scylla and Charybdis, against its enemies on the left and the right, except liberals have forgotten how to fight against the right because they spent 60 years without having to do this. Traditionally, though, liberalism was always based on three pillars: freedom, markets, and morals. That is politics, economics, and morality, and even, gasp, religion. The vast majority of 19th century liberals understood that you could not have a society in which no one need be afraid, without political guarantees, without a free market economy, and without solid moral foundations. Not exclusive moral foundations, but moral foundations nevertheless. Otherwise, liberalism would necessarily be unstable and endangered. And we've seen what happens when liberals cannot confront knotty ethical questions or have nothing to say about them. Pluralism without perfectionism produces populism. Sure, Americans voted for Donald Trump because they didn't like inflation. It's always the economy, stupid. Except it's not really only about the economy. Because when you ask them, do you really think the other side can fix your economic problems? Most people say no. Of course, we know politicians can't do that. They never do. It's really much more about moral issues, issues of moral respect, issues of speaking a moral language to both communities and to individuals. Liberalism has always been about the individual, yes, but 19th century liberals were always good about talking about groups and communities. Just think about Tocqueville and associations, and the original positive association between liberalism and nationalism. But that's another subject we won't go into right now. So we're faced today with the problem of overcoming the weakness of liberal democracy. And let us be clear, liberal democracy is weak. We are not living through the Great Depression. We are not living through hyperinflation, which gave people in the 1920s some excuse for being illiberal. We're living in a world with actually much less pressure on our personal individual lives. And yet, millions of people have abandoned liberalism for populism of one sort or another. Liberal democracy has been weak. We need a liberalism 4.0. And I will even go so far as to suggest we need a rebranding. I no longer talk about liberal democracy. Instead, I talk about democratic liberalism. It's the noun that matters more than the adjective. It's freedom that comes first, and for us, democracy is the best means to freedom, but it remains a means. And we need to say that freedom comes first. We need, obviously, to return to all three pillars, freedom and markets and morals, in order to be able to speak to all the people all the time and attempt to convince them of the merits of liberalism. Liberalism 4.0, democratic liberalism, must be a politics of hope for all, not ressentiment against some. Whether that's ressentiment against immigrants or ressentiment against billionaires. Equality, yes. Egalitarianism, no. And we need to have a message of hope that applies everywhere, not just in Paris, but also in Lille, not just in Berlin, but also in Zwickau. If you cannot promise people a flourishing life where they are, not having to flee somewhere else, don't expect them to vote for you, because they won't. To be slightly more concrete, what do I mean by a revived moral pillar? Well, besides suggesting that video games are not really a good way to spend your life, there are other ways of giving a new kind of moral, religious connotation to liberalism. We can think about green pantheism. We can think about Mother Earth. We can offer hope for the planet from a liberal perspective as part of the program of hope with which liberalism has always historically been associated. If liberalism does not mean progress, why should anybody be a liberal? Not that liberalism can ever guarantee progress. In this, the modesty of the solidarity movement was certainly well taken. But liberalism must be a party of hope, not just a party of fear. Fear will never get you where you need to go by itself. Oops. We need a democratic liberal economics, too. We need solidarity, not fraternity. I will remind those of you who are fortunate or unfortunate enough to have brothers and sisters, I myself am an only child, that your brothers and your sisters always feel that they are perfectly allowed to interfere in all aspects of your business because they're your brothers and your sisters. As an only child observing my wife's family, where there are brothers and sisters, this was not always what filled me with a liberal joy. Rather than preaching fraternity, we need to preach solidarity. Yes, the liberal war on poverty must remain part of the liberal program, but a call for fraternity and its concomitant egalitarianism is another matter. If you demand too much equality, you get too much ressentiment of the billionaires. Rawls was a great philosopher. He was a very bad psychologist. And let me add, of course, that we need democratic, liberal, political institutions that work a little bit better than ours have shown to work when faced with the threat of populism. First of all, we must recognize that the people of today are the people of tomorrow. Neither a little more education nor a little more property are going to significantly change human nature. And I promised Carolina that I would add an anecdote because of a little mischance that happened last night. So I will tell you a dream I had. It actually was a dream I really had, which tells you, I think, far too much about this kind of thing. And in this dream, there was a professor who had imagined a wonderful course that he called Introduction to Democracy. And he told his other professors about it, and they said, oh, this is a wonderful course. We're going to give you the biggest lecture room on campus. It will hold 250 people, because everybody's going to want to take your course. And he gives the course, and how many people show up? 25. And so the next year, he cuts the work in half. There's still only 25 people. And the year after that, he gives everybody the highest possible grade, 25 people. Well, one day he's walking out of the classroom talking to his student, and he sees the classroom next door, which also holds 250 people. It's full. In fact, there are people standing in the hallway. And he asks one of them, well, what class is this? And the student replies, oh, it's a wonderful class. Intermediate astrology. And he turns to the student who he's been talking to and he says, why is intermediate astrology full and introduction to democracy empty? And the student says, because people are stupid? And the professor says, why didn't I ever think of that? But we have to recognize that there is the stupidity of the people and the stupidity of the elite. The educated distrust capitalism and peasants, and the uneducated distrust immigrants and the educated. That's the world we live in, the Kluft that was just talked about. But mutual fear and mutual contempt is not a good recipe for liberalism. We need to update Federalist number 10. We need to find ways to check and balance the characteristic mistakes of the educated and the characteristic mistakes of the uneducated, because this division is going to be the key class division of our times. So, in the attempt to stay roughly within my allotted time, we face the potential for catastrophe. And we need to think different thoughts. In thinking about the project of democratic liberalism, I have been struck by how few new ideas anyone's had for the last 40 years. All of our debates, deliberative democracy, changing systems of voting, always, of course, Americans love proportional representation. Europeans note that proportional representation doesn't necessarily solve everything, and so on and so forth. None of these are new ideas. They're all really footnotes to John Stuart Mill's On Representative Government, first published in 1861. We need to think differently. We need to use words differently. We need to talk about democratic liberalism as a starting point, simply as a means of helping us to think new, in Abraham Lincoln's famous words, to disenthrall ourselves from the phrases of the past which are inadequate to our stormy present. We need democratic liberalism because freedom is, of course, the only good choice today in a world where far too many people are making the choice for a world without freedom, for some, for a world in which some people will be afraid. We, as liberals, need to stand for a world in which no one need be afraid, no individual, no community. And this is the challenge that faces us in our turbulent times. I've provided some very broad guidelines for the ways in which we might approach solutions. Please note the plural. And I hope and expect that the rest of our discussions today will help to fill in some of those blanks and to give us some idea of what the new solutions will be to a new problem and a new world and a new way towards freedom. Thank you very much.